In the hall where Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Volodymyr Zelensky had gathered, there was a tense silence, one that could be felt even by those watching the meeting only through their screens. Trump, having returned to global politics with unexpected energy, tried to present himself as the chief peacemaker, the man capable of cutting through the most tangled knot of our time, the war in Ukraine. Putin, restrained but with sparks of stubbornness and cold calculation flashing in his eyes, listened without interrupting, though everyone understood that in his silence lay a rigid position and readiness to defend his own. Zelensky, exhausted from years of struggle yet filled with determination, spoke of the pain of his people, of cities reduced to ruins, of the thousands of lives the war had claimed. His words sounded not only like a plea for help but also like an accusation toward those who could have stopped the tragedy earlier. Trump shifted his tone between hard and soft, pressing Putin to yield for the sake of the future, then reminding Zelensky that peace demands compromise. The atmosphere in the room resembled a chess match, where each move could alter the fate of millions. Beyond the walls of the negotiations, the whole world followed every word and gesture. Some hoped for a long-awaited breakthrough toward peace, while others feared that the meeting would only pour fuel on the fire. This dialogue among the three leaders became a symbol of an era in which personal ambitions, the destinies of nations, and the hopes of people intertwined into one tense drama. The room seemed almost frozen in time. Cameras had been carefully kept at a distance, journalists barred from entering, and only a handful of advisors were permitted to stand quietly along the walls. Yet the weight of the moment pressed down like a storm cloud. Donald Trump sat at the center of the polished table, leaning slightly forward, his hands clasped as if ready to strike the air with a sudden gesture. On his left, Vladimir Putin rested back in his chair, expression carved from stone, though his eyes burned with calculation. On Trump's right, Volodymyr Zelensky leaned in as though the very act of speaking might be his last opportunity to make the world understand the grief of his nation. Trump broke the silence first. His voice carried the familiar blend of showmanship and bluntness, a rhythm designed for cameras even though none were rolling. He reminded both leaders that history was watching, that people across the globe expected solutions, not more destruction. Yet even as he spoke of peace, his tone was sharp and edged that hinted at pressure rather than patience. Zelensky responded almost instantly, his voice trembling not with fear but with the exhaustion of a man who had carried the burdens of a nation through sleepless nights and endless funerals. He spoke of villages burned to the ground, of children growing up in basements to the lullaby of air raid sirens, of the unshakable resilience of Ukrainians who refused to surrender their identity. Each sentence was both testimony and accusation, aimed at Putin but also at the world that had so often failed to stop the bloodshed. Putin listened without flinching. He did not interrupt, did not raise his tone, but the silence itself was heavy with defiance. Finally, he responded with his own narrative, a cold explanation rooted in geopolitics, history, and the claim of defending Russia's security. His words were measured, rehearsed almost, but beneath the surface lurked the same iron will that had already shaped a decade of conflict. To him, Ukraine was not just a neighboring country but a battlefield of influence, a wall against the West, and he would not easily abandon that ground. Trump shifted again, his gestures broad, his words carrying the cadence of a salesman who believed he could close even the most impossible deal. One moment he pressed Putin with talk of economic consequences, reminding him of sanctions and isolation. The next, he turned to Zelensky with talk of compromise, hinting that true leadership meant knowing when to sacrifice. It was as if he were playing chess with two opponents at once, trying to control both sides of the board. The atmosphere thickened with every word. Advisors scribbled notes, translators whispered, and somewhere outside the closed doors, the world's media speculated wildly about what might be happening inside. Would this be the moment when peace began to glimmer on the horizon, or would the summit collapse into another exchange of accusations? For the three men inside, the stakes were not abstract, they were immediate and human. Trump, ever conscious of his image, wanted to emerge as the one who bent history to his will. Putin, guarding his pride and his empire, refused to show even a flicker of weakness. Zelensky, carrying the weight of millions of Ukrainians on his shoulders, fought to make sure their suffering was not reduced to a bargaining chip. The meeting had only just begun, but already it felt like a theater where every gesture could be mistaken for a verdict, every silence for a sentence. And outside, across continents, people stayed glued to their screens, waiting to see whether the storm inside that room would finally break or whether it would only fuel the fire raging across Ukraine. Outside the closed doors of the summit, the world waited with restless anticipation. News anchors speculated in urgent tones, analysts drew maps across glowing screens, and crowds gathered in capitals holding their breath. Protesters lined the streets of Kiev, Warsaw, Berlin, and New York, carrying placards that demanded peace, while others shouted that compromise meant betrayal. The air of suspense wrapped the globe like a tightening rope. Every rumor that slipped from the meeting room spread like wildfire. One moment, whispers suggested Trump had forced Putin into a corner. The next, sources claimed Zelensky was being pressured to concede territory for the promise of a ceasefire. The uncertainty was unbearable, and yet it was exactly this uncertainty that kept millions glued to their phones and televisions. Inside, however, the mood was far heavier than any broadcast could capture. Each word exchanged between the three men carried not just the weight of diplomacy but the lives of soldiers on the front lines, the fate of refugees searching for shelter, and the fragile hope of families who dared to imagine that the bombs might one day stop falling. As the discussion deepened, subtle gestures spoke louder than words. Trump leaned back in his chair briefly, fingers steepled, as if calculating the next verbal strike, while Putin's gaze remained unwavering, a quiet storm behind dark eyes that hinted at decades of political mastery. Zelensky, though exhausted, refused to let his posture betray fatigue. His hands gripped the table edge, knuckles white, every so often pausing to gather the right words, the ones that could pierce through years of hardened strategy. The translators worked in near silence, capturing every nuance, aware that a slight Trump intervened with his trademark unpredictability. One instant, he spoke with gravitas about the possibility of a peace treaty, appealing to both leaders' desire to be remembered as statesmen. The next, he wielded sharp statistics and economic consequences like a weapon, reminding Putin of sanctions and the international scrutiny that could follow any escalation. Zelensky's responses became more measured, his words carefully chosen to balance urgency with diplomacy. He emphasized the human cost, not as an accusation alone, but as a stark reminder that the decisions in that room could alter the course of nations and redefine what history would remember. The tension was punctuated by silence as much as by speech. Every pause became a battlefield, every glance a potential negotiation tactic. Advisors scribbled furiously, whispering interpretations into ears that hung on each phrase. Outside, the world speculated endlessly: would Trump's intervention lead to a breakthrough, or would it unravel into another round of accusations and threats? The air inside mirrored the storm outside, the convergence of expectation, fear, and hope. And for the leaders seated around that polished table, the stakes were impossibly tangible. They were not debating abstract ideals. They were navigating the very real potential for life or death, for the continuation of conflict or the fragile dawn of resolution. Minutes turned into hours, though no one inside the room seemed to notice the passing of time. The conversation shifted from broad political statements to the minutiae of territorial control, military movements, and potential humanitarian corridors. Trump, sensing the need to assert influence, alternated between commanding the room with sharp rhetoric and offering conciliatory remarks that hinted at compromise. Each time he spoke, his words seemed to ripple across the table, forcing both Putin and Zelensky to pause, consider, and respond with care. Putin, calm yet unyielding, used these pauses to gauge both his counterparts' intentions, analyzing their tone, timing, and even the subtlest flicker of expression. His strategy was a study in patience. He understood that a single word out of place could undo years of leverage. Zelensky, meanwhile, leaned heavily on his own sense of urgency and moral imperative. He painted vivid pictures of Ukrainian towns scarred by the war, of civilians huddled in basements, of families torn apart and futures stolen. His words were meant not only to plead for immediate action but to remind everyone present, Trump included, that real lives hung in the balance of these negotiations. At times, his voice cracked, betraying the weight of responsibility he carried.